The next person that I want to introduce was going to be here. And he is somebody who has given his life for the pursuit of truth in the public square. Somebody who has been determined to use his platform for good and everything at his disposal to serve us in this generation. The person that I'm referring to is, of course, Jordan Peterson. He is going to join us now online, and this is a moment where we hope that the technology all works just perfectly seamlessly. So I'm now handing over to the man who has been right at the heart of building ARC with us, Dr. Jordan Peterson.
I'm hoping that you can all hear me. So I had the pleasure today of releasing a podcast that I've been looking forward to for a very long time with the world's most reputable atheist. And that's Dr. Richard Dawkins. And Dr. Dawkins and I backed ourselves backed each of us into various corners. And at the end of what we did, we came to a synthesis. I had made the case to Dr. Dawkins that we necessarily see the world through a story, that there is converging evidence, not least from the postmodernists, but from many other disciplines, that a description of the structure through which we see the world is in fact a story. And that discovery holds out the promise of bridging the gap between the religious view and the scientific view. And by the end of the conversation, Dr. Dawkins was excited about the hypothesis. We had sketched out a notion of how a story could seep so deep into our bones that it could determine our evolutionary course and transform our genetic structure. And so that's a very good omen, let's say, with regards to this discussion. What is ARC aimed at? Telling a better story. Why a story? Because a story is a description of the structure through which we view the world. It's a description of the structure that stabilizes us and frees us from anxiety and terror, and a description of the structure that instills the hope that abides within us and that enables us to find the meanings that sustain us through our life. The better story is one that optimizes the balance between that security and that hope. Are the facts supportive of the notion that we should be optimistic about the future? I would say that's not a question that can be answered on the basis of fact. There's always reason to despair, just as there's reason to seek opportunity. It's a moral matter in the final analysis. And we're called upon, in the deepest sense, as people who presume a certain role of leadership, to be faithful and motivating scouts of the future, and to have faith in our ability, working collectively, making the proper sacrifices, adopting the appropriate responsibility to make the future a place of promise and abundance, fortified with the notion that if we conduct ourselves according to the highest ethical principles, that there's no desert that we can't make bloom. I am firmly convinced that that's as close an approximation to an eternal truth as might be managed. That's the story that we're obligated on the highest moral grounds to live by faithfully, courageously, responsibly, and equally importantly, to communicate, particularly to young people, in reference to their vision of the future. That's the better story that ARC hopes to tell. A story that it assumes that the most fundamental natural resource is the integrity of the individual in responsible relationship to the community, laying the groundwork for the trust, cooperation, and peaceful competition that makes the human race an unstoppable force. There's nothing naive about that. There's nothing jingoistic. There's nothing propagandistic. It's a credible and necessary call to the most productive form of arms. And I believe that we are in a position to utilize what will quickly become recognized as a convergence between the scientific and the theological to provide a new, integrated, sustaining, and hopeful vision of the future. I think that's where we're at. I truly believe it. And that's an unbelievably exciting possibility and a much better alternative view of the future than one predicated on the power dynamics that the neo-Marxists insist are the only reality, or the idiot materialist hedonism that fractionates our society and dooms us to a counterproductive and fractious immaturity. So how do we differentiate that? More global vision. Well, part of the ARC call is a call to responsibility. Now, this is a tricky matter. Conservatives tend to value responsibility, but they also tend to value it in a manner that risks a kind of finger-wagging moralizing. Conservatives are duty-bound and orderly and industrious in their temperament. And when they talk to young people about responsibility, that emphasis on discipline risks a kind of degeneration into a tyrannical moralizing that fosters not so much concordance with the responsible view as revolutionary antipathy towards it. I don't believe that's necessary, because there's another way of approaching the issue of responsibility. So imagine that you're in despair about the significance of your mortal efforts, let's say, and you're depressed about your foolishness and tendency to err, and desperate about the existential condition of mankind as a whole, rather depressed, let's say, and hopeless, and you hope to fortify yourself with your memories with regard to your conceptualization of yourself and the world. And so you review yourself autobiographically, looking for solace in your actions. And you realize unquestioningly that the times in your life when you took on the highest responsibility and the highest degree of service to both the future and to other people were also the times when you had the most unshakable faith in your own validity as a living being and in the goodness of the universal cosmic structure, let's say, that in your ability to manifest all the hallmarks of mature responsibility, you discovered something within you that was noble and lasting and of value to you and your future self and to your family and to your community. And that not only was that the case, but that there was nothing better to do than to adopt the path of maximal responsibility. And that's the trick with regards to communicating with the young. We're not built for comfort and we're not built for pleasure. We're built for adventure. We're built for heroic adventure. We're built for heroic romantic adventure. That's where the meaning of life abides, because life is never going to be easy. It's always going to be rife with suffering and threat. And noble romantic adventure of the highest sort justifies the mortal terror. And the proper pathway to that is the pathway of maximum responsibility. That's why you see in the Christian redemption message the insistence that the universal savior of mankind is the person who takes all the sins of the world onto himself. And that means to discover within you everything that there is that's terrible about human beings and everything that's remarkable and wonderful, and to regard that as emblematic of your true nature and your genuine responsibility to shoulder. And then you discover that in that self-conceptualization and that responsible conduct is an adventure that lends sustaining meaning to everything you do, including the suffering. Now, there isn't anything more exciting that young people can hear than that message, the equation between responsibility and adventure. I've talked literally to hundreds of thousands of people around the world in hundreds of forums of the sort that I'm addressing tonight. And every single time I talked about the relationship between responsibility and adventure, the entire audience went dead silent. It's a message that hasn't been promulgated effectively, not least by the conservatives and the classic liberals, for at least 4 decades. Nothing better than the call to responsibility. And we're seeing a shift among young men already across the West in that direction. And so that's a very useful thing to know, that the meaning that will sustain you through the trials and tribulations of life is to be found in the adoption of maximal voluntary responsibility. And that's a sacrificial gesture, by the way. That's the sacrifice of the narrow self, the narrow, hedonistic, immature, underdeveloped self, to the self that extends over time into the future and that involves family and broader community. And that brings us from the better story to the issue of responsible citizenship. We're in a crisis of identity in the West, and that's because we took fractionated individual liberalism to its logical conclusion. Carl Jung said that the logical destination of Protestantism was that each person would become their own church. And that's too fractionated. People who attempt to find their redeeming identity in their own fragmented individuality will fail. We know that self-consciousness, for example, is associated with negative emotion and misery. Communal creatures like us who are deeply social find our purpose in the sacrifice of narrow self-interest to the future, to the people we love, to our families, to our broader community in a hierarchical relationship, all the way up to the nation and beyond. And the identity that everyone in the world is striving to discover or rediscover is not an identity that's predicated on the individual, but the discovery of a harmony between man and woman, man, woman, and child, family, local community, town and city, state, all under whatever transcendent unity beckons at the top of that Jacob's ladder and produces a harmony across all the levels, which is the hallmark of genuine and sustaining identity. And that's tightly associated with this notion of adoption of voluntary responsibility and adventure. And so that's something very much worth knowing. Family and social fabric. We've had a youth-oriented hedonistic culture since, I would say, the mid-1950s. It's not working, and it can't work because there's no difference between radical immaturity and a failed and nihilistic state. When people grow up, they grow up because something other than themselves becomes more important to them than they are. And people generally discover that in family. They discover that in matrimony. They discover that in service to the children who, when born, announce themselves by the nature of their being as more important than the person who gave rise to them. And that adoption of that responsibility for that fragility is no different than the maturity that characterizes the harmonious union between individual, family, community, state, and the ultimate transcendent unity. That's all one thing. We live in a world where having children has become a questionable moral endeavor. And I can't think of anything that speaks more deeply to the pathology of our times than that. That is the story of a civilization hell-bent on its own destruction. And it's inexcusable. And it's dreadful for young people who have to find their sustaining identity in the responsibility that they bear for others, beginning with their wives and their husbands and their children. And we need to tell young people, hopefully drawing on the wisdom of our experience, that there is no more exciting adventure in life than the integration of the self within a functional family and the integration of that within a higher order hierarchical structure. And that any deviation from that, except under the most extreme creative circumstances, is an invitation to, what would you say, self-centered misery and lack of hope. Free enterprise and good governance. Well, what have we learned since the Berlin Wall fell? We've learned that even the poorest societies who turn away from the policies of self-immolation that characterized the Soviet Union, let's say, can become wealthy beyond comprehension in relatively short order. We've seen a transformation of living standards in the world in the last 40 years that's nothing short of miraculous. We feed more people now. We feed enough people well now so that obesity is a bigger problem than starvation. We feed twice as many people as the neo-Malthusian pessimists and anti-humanists presume would be starving by the year 2000. There's no reason to assume whatsoever that we live in a world whose resources are self-evidently limited in the manner that the quasi-biological Malthusian anti-humanists so axiomatically presume. We are not mold in a petri dish destined to overconsume our resources. That's not the biological reality of human beings. The biological reality of human beings is that we can transform our conceptualizations endlessly and stay well ahead of the, what would you say, of the biological limits that characterize the proclivity to starvation that typifies the rest of the biological community. We are creatures of a different order. And if we aim upward and keep ourselves walking the straight and narrow path, there's no limit. There's literally no limit to what we can accomplish. Hell is a bottomless pit. And we've certainly seen evidence of that in the 20th century. And there's no reason whatsoever to assume that the antithesis of that proposition is not equally true, that the Jacob's ladder that's traditionally constituted the pathway to heaven spirals endlessly upward. And that's a much better vision of the structure of reality with its infinite potential and the potential destiny of human beings than the neo-Malthusian presumption of a world with limits and the anti-human, anti-child ethos that necessarily goes along with that. I can't imagine anything more demoralizing to young people than to tell them that their very existence poses a threat to the integrity of the nature that we so carelessly worship. So enough of that. We know that free enterprise, not so much capitalism, but free, let's say, private ownership and free market trade can bring abundance that can bring a level of abundance that's been undreamed of by any society in the past, and it can do that extraordinarily rapidly. And we need to do a much better job of educating people, particularly in the developing world, of the reality of that claim. And also, without unnecessary and crippling, without the unnecessary and crippling guilt that the critics of the free market system are so adept at inducing in more conservative-oriented people who are very high in conscientiousness and very easily led into feelings of guilt and inadequacy and consequence. Those of you who have been successful in the free market system, insofar as you've kept your moral compass straight, have every reason to be justly proud of your accomplishments with regards to the people you employ and the productivity that you manage. And that is a attitude that's very poorly taught by our educational systems and very much exploited by the guilt mongers of the progressive movement who insist that all property is theft and that all accomplishment is, is usurping and power, which is an unbelievably dismal view and palpably false. So part of the ARC adventure is the call for those who are productive and careful and conscientious and responsible to cease indulging in the idiot guilt that is causing Western societies across the globe to abandon their first principles and expose themselves to the revolutionary usurpers who will do nothing but destroy. So we know the pathway forward. We know how to make the world an abundant place for everyone. And we have a moral responsibility to uphold that and to do it. That brings us to energy and resources. There's no difference between expensive, unreliable energy and poverty. If you raise the living standards of people around the world to approximately $5,000 a year GDP in US dollars, they cease to take an immediate view of their life and start planning for the long run because they're not concerned with immediate survival. They can think about the environment that their children and their grandchildren will inhabit, and they become custodians, environmental custodians of the local environment as a consequence of their prosperity. And what that means is that if we worked diligently to drive energy costs down and to make abundant energy available all around the world, not least in the developing world, that we could raise the standards of living of people enough so that they would become responsible stewards of the environment in their own right, in the local manner that would best ensure the maintenance of a healthy biological ecosystem indefinitely into the future. There is no reason whatsoever to assume that human poverty is an aid to the survival of the planet. Quite the contrary. Hungry and desperate people will burn everything in order not to die, obviously. And so there is every reason to assume that our moral obligation as, let's say, custodians of the story that the West was founded upon to bring the kind of prosperity that we enjoy to everyone, in the certainty that if we do so, the people thereby aided will be able to take the longest view of their life possible and become the proper custodians of the planet and the garden, so to speak, that we're meant to be. And that's part of that harmony between individual and responsible conduct that is the hallmark of healthy, hopeful, and secure identity. That's the story. So what's the story first? We live in a story. What story are we called upon to tell? A faithful, courageous, and optimistic story. Why? Because that's what people who face the future without flinching are morally required to do. What's the story? The individual in relationship with a wife and husband, the wife and husband in relationship with their children and their family, the family in relationship to the community and the state. All of that with its own domain of subsidiary power, all aiming upward to some ultimate unity. Ultimate and finally unknowable unity. That's a description of the subsidiary structure of the world, and since time immemorial, that conceptualization has been regarded as the alternative to tyranny and slavery. And so we're at a point where we can understand that and we can communicate it. We know how to produce economic systems that make societies of high trust, that are well worth living in, and that produce life more abundant for everyone. We have the technology to provide ample energy to everyone everywhere in the world if we made that a priority, to drive down its cost, to increase its resilience, to make it reliable, to make it as clean as possible, and to diversify it. There's nothing standing in our way with regard to that except the metaphysical will to make that happen. And in doing all of that, instead of decrying the fact that the planet is overpopulated by cancerous humans hell-bent on the destruction of the natural world, we can make the assumption that if we develop a responsible ethos and bring true prosperity to the world, that everyone so freed from the burden of their toil could aim at a sustainable future and make the world a more beautiful and greener garden that we could walk harmoniously and productively within. All of this is justifiable on logical and ethical grounds. All of it is time-tested and true. All of it is adventurous and exciting. And it's all in front of us for the taking. And so I'm thrilled, I have been thrilled to see the avid participation of Australia in our efforts so far. And I'm very pleased to see all of you in this room tonight. And along with Philippa and David and the rest of the ARC crew, we offer you a sincere invitation to London in February. And we hope that you can determine in your subsidiary manner how to bring the message of ARC that's predicated on responsibility and hope and security to everyone in your local worlds in a manner that helps us build this redemptive community from the individual through the family, through the community, through the state, and upward. And so thank you very much for making the ARC Australia event a reality, and thank you very much for your careful attention tonight.
Jordan, we are so grateful to you for joining us. It's an absolute delight to have you here, and I know this was not a convenient moment for you or your family, and we are just so grateful that you've taken the time out to join us and to spell out that wonderful vision.